20 years of 3D experience in 20 minutes. Imagine compressing 20 years of struggles, triumphs, and polygons into just 20 minutes. Most artists waste years learning the wrong things. You get the exact shortcuts that took decades to figure out. I've worked on blockbuster films, AAA games, and trained countless artists. And one thing I will show about getting the exact shortcuts to figure things out, here's an illustration. So imagine 3D without guidance is like being stuck in a maze. If you have dead ends, you have no progress, you have wasted years looking around, you don't know if you're progressing at all, everything looks the same. But with a map and a clear path, you get the shortcut. In fact, you avoid the pitfalls. In fact, you'll enjoy the journey because you know exactly what to do. And if you want a real life example of this, you probably heard of this before. A squared plus B squared equals C squared. This is the Pythagoras theorem. It took Pythagoras years to discover. Now it's taught to preteens in one afternoon. Elementary students, primary school students learn this in one afternoon. And it took a famous mathematician to discover it. Knowledge transfer equals decades saved. What we will talk about. This isn't a tutorial. It's a roadmap distilled from 2 decades in the 3D industry. You'll learn core skills, pitfalls, proven strategies to accelerate your growth. By the end, you'll know exactly what matters and just what are distractions and what you shouldn't focus on. So about me, my name is Dwayne Elahie. I'm a CG Supervisor in the industry for 20 plus years. I've been mentoring for 15 plus years, taught hundreds of students. Many of them now make 70K plus in salary, and they have moved up their leads and such. I've worked at these studios, EA, Industrial Light and Magic, ILM, and I've been at Pixar, Disney. We haven't met yet, but you've met my work. I work in the visual effects and the animation, feature animation department. You've probably seen Avatar. I have James Cameron Avatar. I've worked on that. Netflix, The Witcher. I was the CG character rigging supervisor for Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Mutant Mayhem. I've worked on tools and rigging and animation and pipelines for Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs. You may have seen these films and TV shows such as K-pop Demon Hunters and Spider-Man into the Spider-Verse. A lot of these tools that were developed by me when I was working on Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs and a lot of other projects that till this day are still being used. As I mentioned, I was a CG character rigging supervisor for Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Mutant Mayhem. Worked on The Witcher. A lot of Marvel projects such as Iron Man, Secret Invasion, Avatar, James Cameron Avatar, Hunger Games, and many others. You can check out my IMDb page for the rest of that. Now into the video. 20 years condensed. First thing I wanted to mention, the early struggles of the early 2000s lessons. That's when I started, early 2000s. I wasted years learning random tools with no direction. And at that time, there weren't really much tutorials out there because CG was just coming off of like SGI machines and is only coming out to desktops. And luckily my school had some copies of the 3D software. But in terms of tutorial, there wasn't much out there. There's things like for Lightwave, for Bryce, Maya, 3ds Max, but back then it used to be called 3D Studio Max. And yeah, there is just in terms of techniques, and even having access to it was very hard. What I would say though is pick one software and master it and learn the fundamentals first, because back then, if you just at least knew 3D software, you'll get a job just because it wasn't accessible and is brand new and things were still being discovered, still being learned, techniques. And the people who knew the fundamentals, such as the 2D artists who were the animators, the painters and drawers, they weren't into 3D at first, so it seemed like two separate skill sets. So people who learned 3D were more technical. And as you could look at video games and look at films during that time period, from the 2000s all the way up till now, you'll see there's a progression, especially between the 2000 to like 2010. You see the skill level is upgraded because people with fundamental skills started learning 3D, or they're being taught, or the people who learn 3D started learning the fundamentals, and those skill sets started to reflect in the work. And then so at the beginning, it was just early stages. I was just learning 3D just in general, just what it is and just the technical stuff, right? Then I started being aware of pipeline. So pipeline awareness. There's a big difference between a hobbyist learning versus industry workflows. Nowadays, you might see a lot of like separation. Yes, like for example, Blender is used by a lot of people because it's free, but Blender's been around for 2 decades, and the mentality behind it at the time was that's mainly for hobbyists. The people weren't serious because anyone could pick it up and they just wanted to make art. But if you want to work in the industry, when you're actually delivering a product, you have to learn some workflows. And I learned the difference between that here. When I first started out, like I was mentioning before, early 2000s, I was just picking up anything that had 3D in it that I could get my hands on. And one of the first books was by, I hope I'm pronouncing the name correctly, Michel Madosian. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing the name. But when I used to go to school in the subway, they had like book sales that were selling books like at discount. At the time, 3ds Max 3 was older. And this book, I think I bought it for like $2. So I bought it. I never touched a 3D software ever before, but during my ride to school every day, I would take this book and read it from cover to cover. I didn't understand anything that was going on, but at least I saw the concepts. So at first, I was more of like a hobbyist. I was just learning the tools, right? But then when I started learning 3D, I started picking up a lot of things. And at the time, I found this book, 3ds Max 6 Animation, 3ds Max 6 Animation, CG Filmmaking from Concept to Completion by Barrett Fox. And this was the first time that I've seen an end-to-end, how do you create like a storyboard or a concept art from scratch, and how you build the characters and how you animate them. And then first time I've ever seen HDR or HDRI, like high dynamic range imaging. Never heard of that beforehand. And even back then, it wasn't even easy to get those files. You had to like make them yourself. But it introduced me to the world on how to put things together. This introduced me to rigging as well. As well in terms of how do you make a digital puppet to animate your characters. So I went through the book. The thing about this, as you could see, it kind of like it can only teach you so much because certain sections could only be, let's say, a page or a paragraph. For example, I think HDRI section was only like 1 paragraph long. So it gave me an idea what it was, but I wasn't a master of it. But what was good about it, it made me aware of pipeline. And when it did cover pretty much end to end what generally a 3D pipeline would be. So now I was aware of those things. And now I had to start understanding. I actually went and made my first short film. It took me a few months. I went through the book, did everything. I say short film, I mean, it was like 15 seconds, which was a big deal back then because computers were so slow. It took hours to render a single frame. So I had to let it run for like 2 weeks or something like that. And I remember showing like my brother, and he's like, yeah, that seems cool, but like doesn't look as good as what you see in the movie. So after all that work, I felt that it wasn't good enough. It wasn't that great. So it felt kind of disappointing. But after I got over that, I did realize, okay, why doesn't it look good? Okay, I have to understand. I was introduced to modeling, how you do texture, UV unwrapping, rigging, rendering, animation, and then compositing, and then editing, editorial in a video editor and all that. How all these things connected. So I said, okay, now I know the overall. I know how they work together. I'm just not good at each thing. So now when I started looking at up tutorials and books, they were a lot more guided because I said, okay, it looks like terrible. It doesn't look as good as these characters because I didn't know how to light or how to render or how to model. So I'm going to study modeling. And why wasn't it animating or deforming correctly? Because my rigs weren't good. But even if I improved the rigs, it wasn't deforming properly because the topology and the edge flows weren't good. So I spent time learning each section to improve it, and you just get better and better. But again, this introduced the overall process. And this is when I said, okay, now I started off with the technical stuff, right? And it was just hobbies. So I learned this book, and at least I was aware of the concepts before. And I forgot to mention about this. One, this used to be called 3D Studio Max before they switched it to 3ds Max. And 2, I was fortunate that I read this whole thing, and it just so happened that in my school at university, I went to McGill University, I was studying chemical engineering at the time, which had nothing to do with 3D. I was helping out some of my friends who were in architectural, or were studying to be architects. And we learned, I forgot the name of the 2D software they use for architects, but then they bring it into 3ds Max to actually make it into 3D. Oh my gosh, I can't forget the name. I forgot the name, but yeah, it's a known 2D software that architects use, and then after you import those files into 3ds Max to actually make it out into 3D to do architectural visualization, right? And it just so happens that the school had licenses of 3ds Max or 3D Studio Max, and I read this book. So now when I started seeing the tools, at least it kind of recalled because I saw it before. Even though I read the book, never touched a 3D software before. And you have to understand, back then, you didn't have access to 3D software, even though they were coming on desktop. It was still expensive. It was still very niche. Not many people knew how to use it. So, and if you were a hobbyist, something that was more affordable was like Lightwave, which is like $1,000, or Animation Master. I think it was maybe $200 or $300. I don't remember. Something like that. 3ds Max and all that, and Maya back then, I recall, was like $50,000. But back then, it used to give you like a whole bunch of textbooks to learn it, at least the tools. Now they're like in the help files. And actually, what's another thing that was good is both Maya and 3ds Max or 3D Studio Max, the help files were full tutorials. Like for example, when I discovered rigging, I then went through the tutorials and I understood what the rigging section was in 3D Studio Max, which was written by Michael Comet, which I met when he works, I don't know if he still works there now, but I met him at Pixar when I went to Pixar. So that was, if you guys don't know Michael Comet, he was kind of known back in the day. You should look him up for that. And as also he created, like I guess the Comet muscle system for Maya. And he used to do a lot of, it's probably still up there, a lot of scripts for 3ds Max and Maya and plugins. So back then you learned a lot from him. So it was really cool that these things helped me learn that. And then actually when I like, for example, the reverse foot roll, I learned it from him. So when I met him at Pixar, that was pretty cool. Anyways, I digress from that. But back to this part. So like I said, at first, I just learning 3D in the early stages, just this book just taught you the technical stuff. Then you're just messing around. But then this book helped me understand, okay, there's workflows and you have to learn how all these things work together. And if you don't do one of these things properly, it's going to mess up the next thing. So they all have to work in harmony, well, like in concert, to make a beautiful symphony, I guess you could say. Symphony. So then, okay, so now you know the technical stuff, you know how it works in a pipeline, but now the fundamentals, right? This is where I started learning, okay, now you could technically put it together, but why doesn't it animate well? Why doesn't it look proportional or look good? So the fundamentals you still need to learn, like anatomy, proportional. I said light, actually, that should be lighted. Like lighting, like there. Like lighting and like compositing, all that, animation, color, all these stuff never go out of style, right? These things never go out of style. Like color grading, color correction, things like that. Cinematography, all those things come out of style. And what really drove it home was Jeff Liu's Killer Bean 2, The Party, which was a short film that came out not too long after the Matrix movie came out. And what made it notable, at least to me, I think to most people though, was the fact that he recreated the Matrix bullet time in here. But then when you looked at this stuff, you're like, wow, his animations were good. The story was great. Yeah, he used Animation Master at the time, the software, and that was accessible to people, right? And you could show, and there's one person who made all this stuff, right? So it showed that, wow, you could really excel at this, right? And so now you start comparing yourself, like, why does my stuff don't look like that? And then not too long after, Jeff Liu released Character Animation with Jeff Liu. It was a 3-part series, and that's when I was introduced to animation and the principles of animation he talked about alongside with the technical stuff. So now I started learning, okay, technically how 3D works, pipeline if you want to make a real production stuff, but you have to know the fundamentals if you actually want to make it look good. So that's what introduced that. You should definitely check out his stuff. It's history in CG 3D history, I guess, world. So other thing I would say that I learned after that, I learned all these things. I'm like, okay, well, I want to get in the industry. And in this industry, what I've learned, and it still is to this day, it's your portfolio over resume. Portfolio is what gets you the job, not certificates, not, I can't really recall anywhere. It's not like, I'm also like I'm actually a coder as well, a programmer. And like there again, yes, your portfolio and what you've done, it matters a lot, like major projects you have, but the school and the places you worked, same thing, at least places you worked as well in the 3D industry matters as well here. But at least in programming, your school and your certificates hold a really, really big deal. In this industry, it's not as much. I mean, it could be an indicator. I mean, like if you had an animation mentor certificate, maybe like 20 years ago, that was a big deal. But now a lot of people teach animation at a high level. So it might not hold as much of its impact as it did back then. Not saying it's not impactful, but in general, because at least back then, that was the only people who were teaching, like Pixar animators were teaching how to animate when most people didn't know how to animate, right? So that was, if you had that certificate back then, that was a big deal, right? But nowadays, because a lot of things, there's a lot of skills all over the world, certificates don't matter as much. As more about your portfolio and how you get the job done. And the other like early mistakes when I did show the portfolio is showing too much work, right? Versus just showing your best work. For example, when you're starting out, let's say you learn animation, right? And I'm like, okay, now animation is actually like my favorite discipline in 3D, but it requires so much other things that you have to learn. I actually had learned modeling, texturing, rigging, and all that rendering just because I wanted to animate. I just had to do all those other things. So it was more of like by necessity I learned these things. But animation is my favorite thing. But this keeps moving really fast here. So with that being said, with the animation, when you're starting out, you want to practice the principles of animation. You want to practice like anything. You want to get better at it. So you just keep doing, let's say you want to learn a walk cycle. So let's say you do one every single day. I know someone who they did, to get better at animating walk cycles, they made one every day. And the thing is, they showed that in their portfolio. The thing is about that is that it's the same walk cycle. So there's nothing new. It wasn't like, it was a generic walk cycle. A higher level of animation is actually acting or a character. You actually feel like this inanimate or these pixels on the screen are real, right? So it's not like it's a walk cycle with a personality. If he's sad, he's happy. He just got bad news, and you could see in his pantomime like how he's acting in his walk, or he just, he's happy because he got good news, and he's not, or if it's stylized and all that, it wasn't using any of that. It was just using the generic walk cycle, like the mechanics of it, right? So showing 20 of those in a row doesn't add anything. You only need to show one in your portfolio. If you had a different walk cycle that showed something different, it conveyed something different, it adds to it. Like I just mentioned, one's sad, one's happy, one's stylized, one's realistic. Maybe one's for a quadruped, like an animal. One is for biped, like a human with 2 feet, right? If you're showing something different and you're adding to it, you could add. It's different than what you've shown before, and you're showing your range of skills, then you could add it. But if you're doing 20 of the same thing, you don't need it. A lot of times when people are looking at demos, people reviewing it, someone who actually knows what they're looking at, like animation. Let's say I'm talking about animation in this case, but it could be anything, modeling, concept art, whatever you're applying for. They could tell right away by your work, like what level you're at, and if it's something they're looking for, right? So showing 20 of the same thing is not going to help you. The other things, again, employers look for in your portfolio, your clarity, storytelling. Make sure you're able to convey that first, because when you're working on a real project, you have to remember that you're following an art direction. You're giving the end result is supposed to convey something, right? You want to make sure you got that first, and then you look at the technical proficiency. That are you able to actually pull that off? A lot of times, people starting out, they might not be they have the best rigs or the best models, but together with the skill sets they have, they're able to convey something, storytelling, clarity, really, really well. And they're like, okay, this person gets it. Technical things you could get better over time. But if you have the fundamentals we're mentioning here, you have the eye for anatomy, proportion, and whatnot, then you have that instilled, okay, then you'll just learn the software. And not only that, a lot of studios have their own proprietary tools, and even people work, freelancers or people who do even hobbyists have their own plugins and tools and workflows. So you're going to learn that stuff anyways. Even if you know it, you're going to have to still learn it for a project. But what you're not going to learn, you have to know the fundamentals. And you have to know all these fundamentals: anatomy, proportion, lighting, storytelling, cinematography, staging, and if you're animating, the principles of animation, to be able to convey this at will, right? So there's that. And the other thing that I've learned is networking and visibility. That's really, really huge. How I broke into studios, it wasn't just talent, it was relationships. And what I mean by that, when I was learning 3D, I was learning all these things like I mentioned, learn the technical stuff first, then learn, okay, industry workflows, and then, okay, start learning fundamentals to put all these things together. But it doesn't matter what I know if nobody knows anything about me, right? So I started looking up meetups, looking up anywhere that 3D artists would congregate. So I found about conferences, and at the time, yes, conferences were super expensive. I mean, they still are. They're like $1,000 to go for the few days, the weekend, the week. Like if you go to SIGGRAPH and all that, that's just the cost of them. But I learned something that someone told me. He says, yeah, if you're starting out, you don't have to pay that. You could volunteer. And as a volunteer, I just started for years. I volunteered to go to conferences and just follow any type of meetup. Like, for example, when 3DS, I think 3DS Max version 8 came out, they had a presentation to show the new features. So I went and booked to go there to see it. And in fact, it was like in a city that's 6 hours away from me. That was a month. I just wanted to go there just to network with people there, and it was really, really, really helpful. Actually, that's going to be another story, but even something that happened recently was because of that action I did back then. And that would never, ever have happened if I didn't do that, right? And in fact, I was informing a friend yesterday about how big networking is. And he was telling me a story about how he knows someone that was happened to be talking to someone else, and then they found out what they did and they're like, oh, you deserve better. I'm actually not knowing that they were pretty high up in that company. And he said, send me your resume, I'll get you a job. That's literally how it works. But you have to put yourself in your position, and you're like, okay, how do you do that? Well, you have to actually, again, I actually teach that in a course for both our 3D courses and our programming courses. So that's a whole other skill set of how to do that. But the bottom line, I'll just give the high level of it. You have to put yourself out there. You have to create the situations. Like, where are they going to be? Be there. And I actually have an upcoming podcast of someone talking about that same thing. It's a person who's actually writing the Mega Man comic books right now. He's the current writer of it. That's just the Mega Man X ones that just came out just last month, and they're coming out for the next like 2 years. He's the one who wrote that, and I interviewed him in the podcast, and he mentioned, which is I would say is true, is that relationships or deals, he said, like, deals are made in the bar, right? So yeah, you go to conferences and people talk and you exchange, but when you go, it doesn't necessarily have to be the bar, but it's basically somewhere where your networking happens, so you can actually talk to the people, because they need to know about you first, and then once you have a relationship, they're like, okay, I like you, what do you actually do? And then they'll actually look at your stuff. If you go in and just try to apply to jobs online and just send your resume in, you have a very, very, very low chance. It's the worst thing to do. Sometimes that's your only option. It's a huge numbers game that will take months, and you have to do hundreds of it. But the main why it's hard is that, one, it's usually like HR or someone who pre-filters it, and they don't know. They do that for many departments for many different things, not just 3D, and they don't necessarily know your discipline, so they don't know what they're looking at. So they're given kind of like a broad keywords or things to look at, and when you apply for a job, you're one of thousands of people. It's how you get the signal from the noise, right? That's when we go to networking and get visibility. People notice you, And they said, yeah, there's a lot of competition. Yeah, but if they know your name, they'll look at you first even if there might be thousands of other people better than you, right? So what I was doing at the time, I was posting online. Back then, it was a lot harder than it is now. Now you have social media. Back then, you had to create your own website. I had to figure out how to go buy my own domain, how to register it. Then I had to code my own. Luckily, I knew how to code, right? I had to code my own website from scratch to make my own blog. Then I had to learn how to video edit it. Again, back then, you didn't have all these tools as you do now. Even video on computers was a big thing. We didn't have YouTube yet, right? So then sharing my process, making blogs, making tutorials, building it. And then actually when you start making blogs, people reach out to you and then you start making connections and you get known for that. I entered competitions that they had online. I remember entering a Firefox competition. I didn't win. I would post on there and real professionals who were way more advanced than me at the time would just shred my stuff apart and I would feel bad thinking, okay, I wasn't good. And yes, I was learning and I wasn't as good as them yet. But what I found out, it did make great portfolio pieces because when I did show those stuff to other like recruiters in person when I networked, I thought, okay, this is not good. And they thought it was great, especially for my skill level, right? Like I mentioned this in an earlier video where don't like you compare your chapter 1 to someone else's chapter 20. Yeah, they're way ahead of you. You're gonna eventually get there if you keep progressing, but you're where you are right now might be still good for certain levels. You might not be at the top yet, but it might be good enough to get certain jobs and while you get better. So that's what I learned about that. You have to be proactive and go out there, right? The other thing I learned, especially in this industry, both technical industry just in general, like I said, I'm also a coder, like a legit, like actual coder, right? And you have to evolve all the time. You have to be evolving with the industry. So I would say my skill set started around PlayStation 2 era. And I like to measure with the PlayStation because when they're enumerated, they're numbered. So PlayStation, well, PSX or PlayStation 1, you could call it, then PlayStation 2, 3, 4, 5. Pretty much 3D is the same across, but it just gets better with the limitations and what you're allowed to do, the memory, if we want to get to the technical parts of coding, like if you start measuring Big O for time complexity versus space complexity and all that stuff, you could start looking at these things and you could measure, okay, if I'm working on a PlayStation 2 level project, I know what poly count I could use, what kind of bone count for the rig, how much vertex weighting influence I could use, what level of texturing, what level of shading I could use. Versus if I'm doing, let's say, PlayStation 5, I mean, okay, I could pretty much use kind of like a near movie workflow, but then I have to do the optimization step, right? Especially if I'm working on Unreal. But basically, I started off with this era where we didn't have AI tools. We didn't have, UV unwrapping was really hard. It was very basic tools and it took like days to do it and it was a specific skill. But as things evolve, you just improve your skill set. The artists who adapt survive. Those who don't get left behind. So I learned current trends. AI, I went and got a degree on it and specialized in it afterwards, right? And learned Unreal. I saw the industry is going to that. Look at how many things Unreal are doing. Unity as well, right? Though Unreal is more like visible in terms of like the graphic wow factor. Again, marketing as well. That's another thing, and just user base as well. But I've been to Unity DevCon conferences, and I saw like, wow, Unity actually is pretty powerful. The problem is when I go speak to the developers who made those projects, they said, yeah, a lot of these toolsets are not available. So whereas under Unreal, it's a lot easier to find or recreate those type of toolsets. And Blender, I've been using Blender for 20 years, and mainly because in the industry, especially in studios, the licenses for Maya, for ZBrush, and there's a lot of other things at the time, Mudbox, Motion Builder, then Houdini, a lot of the 3D software, right? That it costs money to do it, right? So even in studios, so the studios might not have licenses for everybody. There might be a floating license where, okay, only 3 people could use this at a time. And I might have to do certain tools. Like, for example, I've talked about UV unwrapping. At one point, I forgot what it's called. Was it UV Master? There's a tool that came out that made UV unwrapping really, really easy. And then Blender integrated something similar into it. So when I didn't have access to the license to that tool, which I knew the person, well, I knew someone that actually knew the developer of it, of that tool. But when we didn't have access to it, I couldn't get the license. I used Blender because it was free, and I used that tool set. The thing is, Blender have evolved so much that now, recently, Blender film, a project that had been made in Blender, just won an Academy Award this year, right? So yes, there's proof that Blender is up there on the technical level. So it has moved away from. It has moved away, but people are more realizing that you're moving away from Blender as a hobbyist learning tool, which was thought of back then. Especially, the interface is so weird compared to other industry tools, and then they kind of like modify that so it's more standard. Like you had to use like the G, S, and R to rotate, scale, and grab to move, and they didn't have back then like the early, like I believe before 2.78 version. They didn't have the gizmos to move things around. You had to use the 3D cursor, which actually is a cool idea when you get used to it, but it was weird. Nobody did that stuff. Now, Blender is so powerful that it's a main thing. Like, we teach it in our courses because, we get very similar results for free. And you don't have to spend thousands of dollars for it to have access to it, or go to spend tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars to go to university to learn, let's say, Maya or ZBrush, because that's still the official way to learn it, right? You could get those skill sets and learn the fundamentals, as I was mentioning here, which is, where I mentioned it here, learning about the fundamentals here, like anatomy, proportions, lighting, animation, all that stuff. You have production quality stuff with Blender now, right? So yes, it's a current trend. You should learn it. You should learn AI. You should learn Unreal. You should learn Blender. Everyone's moving towards these things, even major studios, right? Again, tools change, but the principles still remain. And yes, I know I got a question in the comments before, should I learn the fundamentals? If you want to move up in your career in the industry and don't want to just be like a junior and you're just given boxes to model and chairs to model your entire career, learn all these things and be proactive and show it. That's how modeling leads, animation leads, lighting leads, and all that, they understand all these things because they can communicate with the art director and bring their vision to life. Yes, you want to make sure you always know the fundamentals because the tools will change. The courses we taught, I've been teaching it for over a decade to 15 plus years now. I taught it in person. It started off with like 3ds Max, Softimage, then went to 3ds Max, then we went to Softimage, which is now used to be called XSI, then went back to Softimage, which is now deprecated. It's been retired or sunset. Then we taught it in Mudbox and ZBrush. Taught a little bit of Houdini and things like that. But like now we moved it over to Blender. The principles never change though. It's the same thing. We're just showing, okay, well, this is how you do it in Blender. And it's great because you get the same type of quality and it's free. And then not only that, people might ask, okay, well, isn't Maya and ZBrush still the industry standard? Yes. That's why we basically said, well, once you learn the principles, it's free, and you apply for a job and they say, do you know Maya and ZBrush? Okay, well, we made tutorials to showing you Blender to Maya, like how to map that. And you'll see that once you know the tools, okay, your principles still work, right? So make sure you still learn the current trends, but don't forget the principles and the foundation, especially if you want to move up and level up as an artist and for your career to move up as leads or supervisors or directors of your departments. Now, the hard truths that I learned about this, the realities when working in the industry. Burnout is a real thing. And almost everyone I know has burnout. The reason why, in a real production, again, you're trying to, whether it's a movie or a game, most likely if you're in a real production, it was announced, is being marketed, the date has been set for its release. There's a deadline. You're racing against the clock, and it doesn't exist yet. So and it's an iterative process. It's a creative process. So art direction, and especially getting focus groups and figuring out what you make a version. You make either, if you're in games, you might make like a beta version so people can try it out, get feedback. If you're in films, you do a version of the movie and you do a focus group to see how people resonate with it for your target audience. And based off that feedback, which is pretty often, especially in film, that was like weekly. We had weeklies and that's why you do storyboards, that we would sit down. Like I mentioned before, I worked at, in many places, but like, for example, at Sony, like there's a lot of other projects that weren't even released I worked on, but like every week we'll get a version of the movie in storyboard form, or if they were already rendered, we'll use a rendered form, or if they're in not looked at, but animatic form, or if they're in layout form, whatever stage they're in, we'll see that for those shots. But you pretty much have the entire movie. You see a version of the movie of Act 1, Act 2, Act 3. Your scene sequence shots all there, right? And then we get feedback of what people like or whatnot. And then based on that feedback, in the focus group, they'll go back and change it. And the next week, they'll make a new edit of the movie. And this is why you want to do storyboards, because it's super fast to just draw out your camera framing and get the idea and do the voiceover scratch. You have scratch or like temporary music or temporary voiceovers, but you get the idea of the entire movie, right? So how does that relate to burnout? Your deadlines don't change. The deadlines, you don't get extended. You're still promoting things that don't exist out there, getting people excited. And a perfect example of that is Sonic the Hedgehog. When they first showed the first version, people complained about it, hated it. They have to go back and change it. The look of Sonic, right? Deadlines didn't really change. So you go out, you get burnouts because you made the whole production, you made the modeling, the rigging, animation, or whatever. They put it out there. You get feedback either from the clients or from the directors or art director. They're like, yeah, I don't like that. You have to go all the way back to the pipeline and start over. Your deadlines don't change. A lot of people have a burnout because then you have to work ghost hours or over the weekend, or you see on 12s, or on 12 meaning like 12 hours, extra. So, and this is why like I learned coding, especially for 3Ds. So I could if I'm doing rigging, for example, I think that's one of the best examples to use coding, but I make tools and coding for all these things, which again, I mentioned before, is still being used on all these projects. So imagine if you did this by hand and you did a rig, right? Doing it from scratch with no tools. It could take you, depending on the level of what you're working on, a film or a game, and the level of complexity, like I mentioned, it's PlayStation 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or whatever. Or if it's a feature film, or if it's a VFX film that's photorealistic and all that, it could take you weeks to months to build a fully articulate rig. So imagine now you're given an art direction to say, okay, they could only kind of like assess it once everything's built and they render it out and they have it either on the plate on the VFX or you have it in the game. And they're like, yeah, I don't like how it's moving. Go back and change the rig to articulate it and change the modeling to do that. You just start from scratch. So people have to stay in and have to build it out. So yeah, you have burnout trying to catch up to that. But if you know how to code and you could go in and just make those changes, press a button, or just use a tool and it will rebuild things for you. So that's very important. And that's why you want to learn workflows. You want to learn coding. You want to learn AI to help. Those are the places where AI and tools and coding help you out. It doesn't change the fundamental stuff, right? That's still you. But in cases like that, that's why you want to use the tools. And that's where the money is spent. That's where your time and resources are spent, right? And with that, perfectionism, right? When you first start out as a hobbyist, or if you can still be a hobbyist or an artist, you are that, right? I mentioned that before. You want to be perfect. You want to make everything great, right? But once you get in the industry, and I just mentioned, you have deadlines. You have real projects to be done, and it has to be done by a certain time. Perfectionism, you could probably never get it, because I mentioned this earlier before, but it's anyone who works in the industry knows this triangle, right? You have this, and you have like time, the order doesn't really matter, money, and quality, which I'll write out here. It's kind of hard to write with a mouse here. You have quality, right? And they say pick two. Pick two of these, right? So perfectionism, if you have all the time in the world, theoretically, you had all the money in the world, and you could do any quality that's the highest quality you want, you could get perfectionism, right? Be perfect. Now, in reality, does that work out? As an artist, what is really perfection, right? It's you're always trying to express yourself. You could always be better. There's something to improve, right? So that's why a lot of artists or hobbies you hear, actually in one of my podcasts I had that as well, where you hear that someone who does this as a hobby or who's an artist who want to make it perfect, they could spend years on a project, not years necessarily every single day working on it the whole time. They're doing it on and off because they work when they want to be inspired, right? So time is might not be used to the most optimal way because they do it when they're inspired. Money, it's not necessarily like their own time, so it's their own money, so it's not really as much, but the quality is really pushing it. But the thing about that, it might never get finished. Whereas in a production, you have a finite amount of money, you got funding for it, you have a timeline, a deadline to finish it. Based off of these, you try to balance out the maximum quality you could get. So that leads to learning how to finish a project. Is given your restraints, given your resources, can you get to a finished project, right? And again, that's why you have to be careful with the comparison trap I mentioned here. Actually, if you read the book The Illusion of Life from like the 9 old men from Disney, this is pretty much talking about the principles of animation, which here Jeff Liu is referencing as well. That's where he learned the principles of animation. They actually talk about why does Disney create characters based off of simple shapes. Well, and there's a chapter in there where they talk about, well, they would love to make super detailed characters, but there's a time and there's a money aspect. They don't have all the time in the world, and there's a certain amount of money you actually have to pay, artists to build these things out. There's a certain amount of time you have to pay for just having the building and just having the equipment and all that. So, and you have to release it by a certain deadline. So based off of that limitation, there's only a certain level of quality that they can maintain. And they decide to go with simple shapes because they can maintain that quality and they can produce it out given these restraints, right? But if you read it in the book, in that chapter, the artist would say, yeah, we're jealous because they compare their work and they would love to do those more detailed stuff. But the reality, again, you're dealing with your constraints, right? So in a production, again, if you're a hobbyist, if you're an artist, you can do whatever you want. But if you're in a production, the most valuable thing is, can you finish the project on time, on the money and the quality that we require, right? They rather that than you chase perfection, because when time's running out, perfection definitely goes out the window. Quality might have to suffer, or you're not really gonna get more money. A lot of times, if you don't finish it with your certain milestone, the project might just die. So you're like, okay, you're not getting any more money, we're not getting any more time. What could we do to maybe maintain a certain level of quality, but not necessarily do exactly everything we want? You have to make compromises, right? And what do studios care about? Reliability. We know that if we give you this project with these constraints, time, money, quality, you could still deliver. Yes, we're dealing with art direction, we're dealing with a lot of iteration, whether it's a game, we put it out there, we gave a beta, and all the critics say we hate this, we need to change this. And like, okay, how do we figure that out? Or if it's a movie, you put out a version, you give it to a focus group, and people mention, okay, we don't like this character, or this act is too long, could you shorten it? How could you problem solve given these constraints? You still have the deadline, you only have a certain amount of money, and you want to maintain a certain quality and have a certain turnaround. Again, having tools, knowing your fundamentals, knowing AI and knowing programming, you can make those decisions on the fly in the meetings, knowing all these things. Like I gave you some example where I was working with a director and we had a focus group, and they said, yeah, the last act is too long And part of it was like the main character was running through a crowd of people. And the original shot was like a single camera, no cuts, and you're running through people. So me, like on like there as like a CG supervisor, technical director, part of that, these are in kickoff meetings explaining what we're trying to do in the shot. And I said, okay, how does that translate to an actual production in the pipeline? Well, we actually have to do a crowd to build that out, which at that time and the amount of time we had, we didn't have that scoped for the project. How important is it that we have that crowd? How important is it that we actually have to go with a single camera and go through the shot? Can we cut it up? Can we have like composited where we have a certain crowd crowd characters in the front, and we could do some procedural tool that we could build and composite the other characters for the background, or maybe even use depth of field to blur them out. And to the storyline, the way the shot was cut originally in the storyboards wasn't that important. It was more what they want to convey. So we were able to make those compromises to maintain a certain level of quality, given the time constraint on our money to do it, right? That's just an example, but that's pretty much what you do all the time, especially as a CG supervisor or any level of supervisor, lead, director. This is why you have to understand your fundamentals. Like I mentioned here, you understand your fundamentals, understand the tool sets available that you have, like these tools available, and also understanding clarity and storytelling. All these have to marry, and in the meeting, you have to make these on-the-fly decisions because a whole team is going to be dependent on that. And if you want to move up in your career, you have to understand these things, right? And yeah, there's so many people. I just mentioned the problem solving, the reliability, the scenario I gave illustrates that. But yeah, you could go on ArtStation, you could go on Instagram, and you'll see so many people with raw talent, and you're wondering, why aren't they working at these big studios? Well, because of these things I just mentioned, of real project deadlines, real project like constraints, iterations. It's not easy, right? And you have to be able to deliver. You have to be reliable on it. Just making great art is not enough if you want to be professional and you want to be recognized for that.
Quick heads up for all you 3D artists watching this. If you've been grinding away at tutorials and YouTube videos but still feel stuck, I've got something special for you. I'm hosting a 3D character rapid bootcamp workshop where I'll walk you step by step through the exact skills studios actually hire for. It's not theory. This is the stuff that got me hired and working in the industry. If you want to finally build a portfolio that gets callbacks and interviews, hit the link below and grab your spot. Seats are limited, so if you're serious about going pro, this is your chance.
To recap, master the fundamentals, not just the tools. Build a strong portfolio. Only show your best work. Don't show like 20 of the same thing. Show something that shows another aspect of your skill set. If it doesn't add to what's already there, don't put it in there. Learn the pipeline, not just one trick. Don't just learn a tool and press a button. Understand what's happening, because as I mentioned before, you understanding that's what's going to make you valuable problem solver, the go-to person, make you move up in your career as leads, as supervisors, as directors, because you understand these things, not because you just press a button, right? And adapt with the times, evolve with the tech, but hold on to timeless principles. Learn the principles of it, learn the fundamentals. The tech makes it easier, but underlying, you just have to understand the principles to guide the tech. The science supports the art, right? So you have to know the art, you have to know the principles to be able to guide the science behind it. You have to guide the tech, right? And again, network and put yourself out there. Make it known what you can't do. And again, if you're not seen, you'll never be known. You'll never get opportunities. You have to put yourself out there to create opportunities. The next step that I want you to do, take just one of these lessons and apply it this week. An example of it, you could update your portfolio with what I was mentioning before. Look for something new to showcase and show it. Don't show 20 of the same thing if you're not adding to the last one. Show something new of it, right? You could be, let's say, creating stylized characters. Maybe one of them is a female and it's more a slender build. Another one might be a larger, might be more of an animal-based one. Show something different that you show your breadth of skills, right? Start with one sculpt with fundamentals. Try try basically learning the fundamental stuff and have that guide you. In fact, we have a course on that where we start off teaching the technical things that we mentioned here. Early stages, you learn the technical stuff, right? But then later on, we start teaching sculpting, and we actually teach anatomy, facial anatomy, body anatomy, and we have isolated studies like this is how you do an eye, and these are the landmarks of the eye, right? And then this is how you do a nose, and this is how you do that. And then we use some concepts. For example, if you could do a head from scratch instead of downloading resources, which is common now, and it's definitely in a production you would use it. You'll buy resources or download them, like for example, packs for scans of heads with all the pores, detail, the high frequency detail, which is great, and you're probably going to use that. But I would suggest to actually use it properly is to learn how to do that on your own and to sculpt it from scratch, which we actually teach with that. And using the fundamentals, a lot of things have been solved in the 2D world, the traditional drawing world and sculpting world, such as using the Loomis method. I find that's pretty useful to teach new people, beginners, how to think of proportions of the head and how to sculpt it out, and then marry that with the technical stuff, right? So going back to that, for the next step, like learning the scope of the fundamentals, I would say purposely start a project where you are doing that, where you're actually focusing on the fundamentals, or do isolated studies of, I'm going to sculpt the hand, or I'm going to sculpt the face, or just the eye or the ear. You'll learn a lot, and also it'll showcase to potential clients or studios or portfolios or employers that you know the underlying fundamentals behind it, right? And of course, share your work out there to show that you're doing these things so people are aware of that, right? And a bonus tip here, teach what you know. When you learn something, document it and start teaching. It accelerates your own mastery. That's what I did when I learned something. Back then, I created a blog and I listed the steps. One, it actually helped me too because it was my own notes. But two, a lot of people came out to it and they're like, that's really great. The faster learners are the ones who share their journey. When you teach other people, one, you'll be surprised at what you actually know. And two, it also challenges you to actually make sure you understand each facet of what you're teaching, because you have to be able to convey that to someone else. It also illustrates, okay, well, there's a gap in my knowledge here. Let me go back and fill that gap. I'm able to pass it on. And you have a benchmark there, because if the person you're teaching is able to pick it up and do it, then one, you know it well enough that you're able to pass it on to someone else. And if you pass it on, that means you know it, right? And there's a saying, I think Einstein said it, don't quote me on this, but I think Einstein said it, is that how well you know something is based on how well you could teach it to someone else. I'm pretty sure I'm butchering that for saying, but it's something along those lines. I believe Einstein said that. I should look that up. And now the biggest mistake to avoid, don't try to learn everything at once, right? That's how I started. Here, as mentioning, early stages struggles, just random tools, everything I saw. In fact, the first time I learned vertex weighting, I think I learned like rigging from the book here, but like, again, they just have like a paragraph or two explaining the general tools and all that. But the first time I actually learned different techniques of, let's say, vertex weighting or skinning or vertex painting, whatever you want to call it. There's so many different names, or binding vertices to bones or joints, depending again what software you're in. It was in a software. I was using 3ds Max at the time. I only found one tutorial because rigging and skinning were super rare, and even now it's still not as sexy as all the other disciplines, so it's still hard to find good resources. There are some out there, but it's not as modeling and sculpting is so much easier to find high quality stuff versus like rigging and skinning. But the only one I was able to find at the time that actually show you techniques and not just this is the tool like you see in a textbook. I forgot the name of it, but it was I think it was in the library of the school. It was one, not in my language, it was in French, and it was not in my software. It was in Lightwave at the time. Luckily, I know French because of the country I'm from. It's required, so I know those two languages, English and French. So that was fine. Though it's still challenging because you're learning new jargon in an industry that you don't know. But at least they say, even in French, they still say the words in English, but I still didn't know what they mean. Like what's binding, what's a vertex, what's vertex weighting, and all that stuff, right? But that's back then. I had to struggle back then. I tried to learn everything, anything and everything that I could get my hands on, just because it was so hard to find things. But it made it, again, I was learning this. I didn't even have the software. I was learning vertex weighting, and it wasn't even in the software, even in my language, right? So my advice to you, especially now, it's so accessible. Don't try to learn everything at once. Learn one thing, make sure you understand it, go to the next, right? Or do a quick overview of everything so you understand the overall process, and then you can start learning one by one. Again, that's what I did here. Once I learned the whole overview from this, then I started going in, okay, my modeling sucks. So how do I go in and learn how to model better? Find resources for that. Okay, my texturing, UV, I don't know that. Let me go find resources specifically for that, right? Luckily now, now we teach courses where we encompass all that for you. The other thing is, don't hide your work for years, waiting until it's perfect, right? It is never going to be perfect, and by the time you put it out there, it probably loses its effect. Or you could have had an effect and got you jobs way earlier if you showed it. Again, it doesn't have to be perfect yet. You just have to show that you're proficient enough on what the person's looking for. What's perfect to you might not be what they're looking for. You might show 10 million different things in that you're good at, and then that one thing the client's like, oh, I need that. That's why you want to show your stuff out there, right? And the other biggest mistake, confusing, right? Don't get confused with like just tool knowledge. Again, when I started out, again at the time it was early, right? We didn't have the fundamentals yet in 3D, so pretty much if you just knew 3D, you got a job. So I was just learning how to use all the tools. Didn't know how to use it well, but I learned how to use the tools with like 3D Studio Max at the time. But nowadays you can't get away with that. You actually, if you want to move up, you can't just get confused just with tool knowledge and just keep, I want to learn this and just doing tutorials. Actually do something with it, and then learn the artistry and fundamentals with it, so you know how to use the tools to actually get the art and express yourself how you want to. And again, these combined is what gets you noticed and move you up in terms of the ranks in the studios. Start becoming lead, start becoming head of departments, directors, supervisor, right? And this is what makes you stand out when you start doing your portfolio as well.